Epistemological Ignorance by Charles W. Mills. 1. Know thyself. The Delphic motto charges us that in the Western philosophical tradition, at least from Socrates onwards, this has taken up a central theme and imperative. The ideal becomes self-transparency, both for its own sake and a step towards self-mastery. The epistemological and the ethical are to work in tandem, eliminating self-deception and other obstacles to appropriate moral behavior and guiding our analysis of and interventions of social situations. In both the Platonic and the Aristotelian tradition, albeit in different ways, self-understanding is linked to self-control, and such individual virtue at the micro level is a prerequisite at the macro level for the construction of the just polis. The good state, whether Plato's ideal republic or Aristotle's aristocracy, is inhabited by good citizens seeking, knowing, and acting rightly. But the strictly limited class of eligible for individual status makes unnecessary or even prescribes any general dissemination of these norms. The guardians and the aristoi need to be far-seeing and to be self-transparent. Those in the lower orders do not, and opacity is perfectly licit for such non-equals. Political inequality is straightforwardly linked with cognitive inequality. It is because of their cognitive inferiority that Plato's silver and brass classes and Aristotle's women and natural slave do not share political power. Epistemic and political deference to their superior is all that is required of them. And if medieval Christianity would later affirm a spiritual community of souls, all equals on God's eyes, it would not repudiate in the temporal realm the necessary hierarchies of ecclesiastical and noble authority over the bodies of the lower orders. In the standard narrative, it is the advent of modernity that radically disrupts and overturns this system of deeply imbricated and hierarchical ranked social and political, moral, and epistemic estates. The Protestant Reformation, the emergence of the individual, the discrediting of a scripted hierarchy, the bourgeois revolutions, the moral and epistemic egalitarianism promised in the manifestos of equal rights and anti-authoritarian Cartesian program to put all belief into question. Suddenly, at least on paper, the epistemic was to be democratized, opened the door to all to know not merely themselves, but the socio-political system supposedly requiring their consent. In Plato's Republic, far from a societal transparency being an overarching ideal for all, even the golden guardians were to be inculcated in the noble lie of the myth of the metals. But now transparency could at least become global and unqualified norm, applicable both at the individual and the socio-political level. Particularly in the liberal society, social contract traditions, supposedly based on the equal rights and non-fungibility of equal individuals. Unlike a later consequentialist liberalism prone to government house utilitarian calculations, hidden from the public eye, that maximize aggregate social welfare at the expense of the unfortunate, equal epistemic access to the political is foundational. Thus, even Thomas Hobbes, who would perversely use the new modern individualist ontology to argue for pre-modern absolutism, introduces Leviathan with the injunction that for the creation of the artificial man, that is the state one need only, nose tipsum, read thyself, since all men can learn to read mankind in themselves, given their similitude of passions which are all the same in all men. In the faculties of mind, there is yet greater equality amongst men, that of strength, so that, contrary to Aristotle's claim that some being innately more worthy to command, meaning the wiser sort, such as he thought himself to be for his philosophy, the laws of nature, governing the creation of the commonwealth, are rationally apprehensible by and equally binding on all. For John Locke, the defender of limited government, it is likewise the case that the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which it obliges every one, and reason, which is the law that teaches all mankind, that all are equal and independent. A law, as intelligible and plain to a rational creature as the positive laws of commonwealth, nay, possibly plainer. Jean-Jacques Rousseau radically transformed political community, different as it is from both absolutism and liberal democracy, nonetheless rests on a symmetrical and reciprocal alienation of individual selves to the whole that presupposes equal cognitive and moral capacity in the creation of the general will. And Immanuel Kant, for whom the contract is merely an idea of reason, declares that the civil state is based on the a priori principle of freedom, equality, and independence, which freedom to make public use for one's reason is all in all matters, being all that is necessary for people to overcome their immaturity and achieve enlightenment. For all four of the contract theorists, then, the ostensibly starting point, in seeming sharp contrast with pre-modern status of cognitive hierarchy, is moral and epistemic equality. In Locke and Kant, the two contractarians most central to the liberal tradition, this egalitarian commitment is preserved in the promised transparency of the political order, not to be trumped by considerations of realpolitik, though Locke's citizens retain the right to revolution while Kant do not. Even when it is denied or equalified, as is the case of the two non-liberals, the Hobbesian citizens who alienate their rights to an absolute sovereign, empowered to censor, or the Rousian citizenry who may require a superhuman legislator equipped with deceptive and manipulative civic religion to bring them to political readiness. This limitation does not rest on their innate cognitive inequality as such, but on their short-sighted selfishness and immaturity. It would seem then that in modernity in general and liberal modernity in particular, we have a transition to a world of self and social political knowing, in which the Delphic injunction, guided by the democratized, non-elitist, and non-discriminatory epistemology, could finally be fulfilled. But the promise was illusory, as Marxist and other class theories, as first and second wave feminists, as critical race theories, avant la lettre, have been pointing out for hundreds of years now. Liberal modernity's break with the liberal pre-modernity, putatively in radical and sharp contrast to it, is very partial indeed. In some cases, matter-of-factly stated in the text itself, and in some cases tacitly assumed or implied, liberalism turned out to be symmetrically illiberal. Even the white male working class is sometimes formally denied equal standing. Locke's proprietarian polity, Kant's regulation of the non-self-supporting to passive citizen status, and all is at all times materially subject to the dictates of capital. Possibly equal in the state of nature for Hobbes and Rousseau, but not Locke and Kant, white women, constituting nearly half the population of your states, become sociopolitical inferiors for all four contract theorists, not all liberated from patriarchy by modernity, but subordinated through the new form of what Carol Pateman calls fraternal patriarchy, the contractual rule of the brothers rather than the fathers. And people of color, a category largely marginal to ancient and medieval thought, except in Christian iconography of the monstrous races, entered the global Europolity as natural subordinates, conquered by the expansionist Euro empires that are also integral to modernity. Hobbes and Locke's incompetent Native Americans unable to leave the state of nature and their own or appropriate it efficiently, Rousseau's feckless savages, Kant's biological racial hierarchy of European, Asian, Africans, and Amerindians. Rather than an unqualified egalitarian liberalism, then, what we actually have is a bourgeois, patriarchal, and racial imperial liberalism, where the supposedly generic men are propertied, male, and white. It is their moral status that is equalized. It is their cognitions that are recognized. It is their selves and the polities which privilege them that determine what can be known. The actual social contract, far from leveling all modern hierarchies, puts some on a different basis, while establishing new ones. It is a domination contract, and its epistemology is necessarily altered. If in pre-modernity the overtly subordinated denied even the pretensions to equality could simply be ignored, now, in an epoch nominally marked by a commitment to equal rights, equal cognitive powers, and equal political consent, those excluded by an inferiority, at least facially in tension with supposedly egalitarian and universalist pronouncements, must be actively denied knowings that contradict the established order. Knowing thyself, knowing thy society would mean coming to know one's identity as victim of an oppressive, classist, patriarchal, white supremacist social political order. But such truths cannot be known if the system is to preserve itself. So, modern epistemology, as a set of norms for guiding cognition, must perforce also include norms that guide it away from any openness to the potentially subversive perspectives of the subordinated. These cannot be partitioned processes, but rather different aspects of the same process. Particularly in states pretending to be liberal, whether Western or Western implanted, which do claim to uphold transparency as a norm, actual transparency would be fatal. What is required instead is a structural opacity denying its actual identity, predicated in Miranda Ficker's terminology on a principled testimonial of hermeneutical injustice to dangerous knowers. The system refusal of credibility to their potential antisystemic claims and conceptual frameworks. Given the actual class, gender, and racial hierarchies of nominally inclusive and egalitarian liberal democracies, an epistemology of knowledge seeking must simultaneously constitute itself as an epistemology of knowledge avoidance, an epistemology of ignorance. Knowing as a general cognitive ideal will thus require, whenever necessary, knowing to not know. What then are the phenomenological implications for the individual of this apparent practical contradiction? This schedule of cognitive norms divided against itself. Imagine that you are one of those flawed cognizers moving through the world. It shouldn't be difficult. You are. You are a body in space, but not a space that is featureless or homogeneous in character, symmetrically invariant around any chosen pivotal point or axis, but rather a space structured through by relations of power and hierarchy. You are a body in a body politic, a part, let's say, since he's the most materialist of the four major counter theories of Hobbes' great Leviathan, the artificial man, the microbody composed of millions of microbodies. As such, you are, in Gilweis's formulation, intercorporeally linked with the other bodies. Your perceptions and conceptions shaped by them, so that your knowledge are always, in the broader transsexual sense, though including the sexual, carnal knowledges, and also, as emphasized, carnal non-knowledges, carnal ignorances, things your body is not supposed to know, not permitted to know, because of their incongruity with the official norms of self-knowing and self-ignoring of the macrobody. Epistemology, as the mainstream of the tradition has finally belatedly discovered, must be social. Hobbes analogized different social political functions to different parts and functions of the body, and some parts and functions are more esteemed than others. Women, the subordinate classes, natural slaves, non-white natives cannot have an equal role in determining the authorized perceptions and cognitives of the macrobody. So the rules that positively valorize the status of being class respectable, male and white, must also negatively valorize the status of being lower class, female and non-white. In learning the rules, then, one is adopting both patterns of behavior and patterns of cognition, deference to certain kinds of testimony and disregard of others, reflexively appropriative or reflexively critical judgments on one's own self-monitor reactions. So you see, you hear, you feel, you smell, you taste all the time to a significant extent without your conscious control. You are conceptualizing, you are admitting for entry, and you're filtering out. You are considering and accepting. You're considering and rejecting. Many theories, many explanations linked to larger meso and macro theories and explanations about these perceptions, about what is going on, about what is happening. And in your corporal human density as a perceiver and knower, you are not, of course, an android or robot or other effectless entity, but an organism moved by emotions, desires, fears, feelings of repugnance and attraction, some deeply embedded and embodied, all which are factored into, combined with, the inputs you are receiving, not just shaping them, but in a sense, making them. Since some are simply filtered out of the spotlight of your perception, while those that are noticed in a certain way, perceptually and conceptually pre-colored. The picture, but it is broader than the visual, of society and self that you have been given requires that you know better to take seriously apparently conflicting perceptions, conceptions, explanations. In knowing to not know, the official epistemology, which is also an epistemology of ignorance, legitimizes, indeed demands, or cognitive dismissal of potentially subvertive counter knowings. But sometimes the noetic system fails. The clash, even dimly perceived, between official and actual reality is too great. The filter malfunctions. The body resists its imposed incorporation. The tension inherent in such an exercise snaps the process the other way, and knowing to not know reveals its ambiguity and Janus facedness. Could it just be, that we should instead endorse know these derogated perceptions and conceptions as the vertical ones, and then, as a corollary, not know, reject the official epistemology, the prescribed norms of cognition that directed us to ignore them? And what would it then mean for the story we have been told of ourselves, society, in relations to our body, of our body to the body politic, and the possibility of developing from those incipient and perhaps still inchoate counter cognitions an alternative perspective on both? So, across oppositional political theories as class, race, and gender, and also in their explicitly intersectionalist incarnations, we find the thematizations of this potential. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci characterizes workers' consciousness as contradictory, simultaneously containing prejudice from all past phases of history and intuitions of a future philosophy, principles of a more advanced science. The common sense that is shaped by bourgeois class domination nonetheless contains a nucleus of good sense, which deserves to be made more unitary and coherent. Du Bois, in the first essay of his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, classically describes Black American situatedness in a racist white world, which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of that world, resulting in a double consciousness, a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, looking on an amused contempt and pity. But he's still confident that a vertical second sight will ultimately enable the Black American to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. From around the United States, indeed around the world, as I write this in December 2017, the Me Too movement has empowered women of all classes and races to recognize that what happened to them, what routinely happens to them, from sexual harassment and groping to outright assault and rape, is not singular, not their fault, not something that they asked for by their dress, their behavior, something they said, but an entrenched and widespread wrong embedded in the inferior position in a body politic controlled by male bodies for whom they are to be permanently sexually accessible. By rejecting the socio-epistemic pressures to say nothing, to keep it to themselves, to recognize that boys will be boys, to accept as falling on them, if anyone, any shame that might attach to the parties involved in the event, women as a group can come to know differently, to not know his story, and to affirm the suppressed truths that their own bodies are telling them. If something feels wrong, it is wrong, and it's wrong by my definition and not necessarily by someone else's. And the hope is that one day, from these multiple intersections of intersecting oppositional sources, an epistemology of resistance can be synthesized to achieve a generally enlightened modernity in which opacity, prescribed non-knowing to obfuscate systemic sociopolitical oppression, will no longer be necessary.